The paper we're presenting today is called Frenemy, How Chinese Print Journalists Perceive and Use the Internet. And for those who don't know, frenemy is a new word. It's a combination of a friend and an enemy. And so in this paper, we argue that the uses, attitudes, and suspicions of traditional journalists toward the emerging electronic media, both positive and negative, shape not only online discourse, but also Chinese politics and society. So I'm going to talk about the enemy, the negative side, and then Maria will take over to talk about sort of the positive stuff. Okay, so in July 2008, journalist He Feng of the feisty Southern Weekend, of course, Nanfeng Zhoumo, started hearing rumors that one of China's largest dairy companies was selling tainted milk that sickened infants all over the country. Of course, this is a story we all know. Because the Beijing Olympics were quickly approaching, however, his newspaper was banned from any reporting on the politically sensitive issue until after the games were over. Only after the Olympics had ended and other newspapers had broken the story did a top Southern Weekend editor reveal the story's earlier suppression and the delay that potentially caused further infant deaths. Crucially, however, he did not publish these revelations in the newspaper, since doing so would be to court disaster. Rather, he presented them on his personal blog, and from there it came to the attention of scholars and the international press. And so we argue that this incident illustrates one of the important facets of the relationship between traditional media journalists and the emerging electronic media in China. The internet, we argue, is simultaneously a competitor, an inspiration, a way to reveal sensitive information, and sometimes a trap for the unwary. So following the discussion of our key scholarly contributions, we sketch out each of these scenarios in turn, very quickly, helping to bring the focus away from studying internet and traditional politics separated from each other and to bring them together. So again, I talk about the pitfalls and then Maria talks about the promise. Obviously, as we've learned over the last 2 days, there's no shortage of studies on China's emerging electronic media, right? But with a few recent exceptions, most studies have concentrated on the internet in isolation from other media. Even the limited scholarship that has examined the relationship between the two media on a systemic scale has not delved into the motivations and attitudes of individual Chinese news workers. Unveiling journalists' attitudes toward the internet is important, as it can illuminate the evolution of journalistic professionalism in China, the shifting of the role of new media, and the political repercussions of these changes. So, as the internet challenges journalists' revenues and legitimacy in the West, especially, many argue that the journalistic profession itself is coming under threat. Although the dominant perspective of the mid-1990s was the optimistic notion that online journalism served as an arena in which outmoded and unsatisfactory news reporting traditions might be repaired and renewed, which is a nice quote, scholarly mood clearly has darkened over the last decade. The internet, blogs in particular, and citizen journalism have presented a challenge really to the fundamental core of journalism, again, especially in the West, but in China to a certain extent as well, which is its authority as a unique, authoritative voice to comment on and shape public affairs. As such, the mainstream media has attempted both to co-opt blogs and to attack them for haphazardly supplying unchecked information. The increasing move toward an endless, 24-hour-a-day news cycle, many argue, threatens to fatally weaken the very foundations of journalistic professionalism. In addition to posing a professional challenge to American and Western journalism, the internet has also brought increasing financial pressure, of course, to the mainstream media. And we see that a lot of American newspapers are under threat or closing, or it's the same thing in Europe. One highly cited study has found strong evidence, for example, that digital content cannibalizes print sales, which is not very surprising. Ever-increasing internet competition, many Western scholars argue, will eventually kill the newspaper business entirely. The study of the internet's influence on Western journalism are therefore permeated by pessimism. A 2009 poll of prominent news workers of the national news media found that nearly 2/3 say the internet is hurting journalism more than it is helping. So basically, the scholarly consensus is that relations between the new media and the old are inherently conflictual, and the impact of the internet on traditional journalism is largely negative. In China, though, we argue that journalists have a significantly more constructive relationship with the internet. Basically, thanks to combined many months of field work and over 100 interviews with Chinese journalists, our findings indicate that most interviewees are worried about the internet's effect on the newspaper industry, while still being cautiously optimistic about the fate of their own jobs and their own papers. Many Chinese news workers are well aware of the Western dynamic and the problems in the West, and they realize that online media presents a competitive threat to their reporting and their news outlets. As traditional news outlets are attempting to establish their online presence, journalists are forced to work faster and focus more on content, just churning stuff out, rather than reporting on in-depth. Authorities in the northeastern province of Liaoning, for example, started a trial in April 2010, whereby papers that fell below 3% of the total newspaper circulation in the area would be quote-unquote punished, with the paper in last place completely eliminated, right? And similar restrictions, of course, do not apply to internet media, but basically, you know, if it weren't competitive enough, right, they're trying to make it even more competitive. And this process is further complicated by the different censorship pressures faced by online editions, of course, which have constantly shifting boundaries. This pressure online is especially acute because of the complete absence of clear-cut rules for deciding whether or not to delete an online post. And so, other than the speed pressure, though, online media raises the standards for traditional journalists to be ever more innovative, professional, and creative if they want to maintain their competitive edge. The editor, a Xinhua editor, summarizes double challenge by saying, on the one hand, the internet intensifies our work routines and presents a big challenge to our business model. We have to react to events more rapidly and be constantly ready to cover them. On the other hand, there are now numerous blogs presenting alternate perspectives to the mainstream news. If we want to compete with them, we need to cover more angles in our reporting, be more innovative, which takes time and resources that we don't always have. So while clearly being aware of and concerned with these challenges, our interviewees largely believe that the new media can strengthen the traditional media and journalist professionalism in the long run, which is a belief that we argue has emerged for several reasons. First, at least some interviewees from the more professional news outlets, right, the Nanfang Baoye Jituan papers, right, the Southern papers, Caijing, Caixinwang, the sort of more professional things that we think of, are resolved to use the internet's challenge as an opportunity for self-improvement. For example, one former online editor from Caijing, who's now at Caixin, spent several months conducting interviews with editors from different publications in the United States and then applied those lessons to Caixin. Not all commercial outlets are this adaptable, of course, but many of the more successful ones have embraced a positive and a persistent attitude toward the new media challenge. Second, a number of interviewees argue that the internet has already improved their media operations by letting them learn about public reactions to their reports, something that was obviously impossible or very difficult in the print era, thus helping to improve content and increase readership. Third, some journalists maintain a strong confidence that the internet increases demand for professional journalists, those who are able to process large amounts of information and accurately report on them. One journalist, a Southern Weekend editor, argues that there will always be a role for professional journalists to play, playing a truth-seeking gatekeeping role, even if economic losses occur in the short term. And for papers that are propaganda papers, papers that are run by various parts of the Chinese government, obviously there's journalists I've talked to there say there's always going to be a role for these papers, right? There's always going to be a role for propaganda, and so their jobs are not in trouble. And finally, news workers argue that the internet portal sites can help strengthen the financial position of Chinese newspapers. China, of course, has the world's largest internet base. And the portals are enormously powerful, Menhu, right? Accounting for an estimate over 20% of website market share in 2011, beaten only by search engines. 4 of the top 10 Chinese most visited sites are portals compared to only 1 in the US. But despite this position of strength, portals are legally barred from producing their own content. Instead, they must rely on reprints, what they call reprints, right, zhanzai, from newspapers and wire services, generally paying a flat fee per year, which for one journalist I talked to in 2007 was 100,000 renminbi a year for his paper, which isn't very much, and I'm sure it's gone up since then. But although interviewees commonly complain that the portals paid too little, the system keeps them from becoming a direct and better funded competitor to traditional news organizations and helps steer traffic and subscriptions to the print media. The results of this regulation is a kind of symbiosis. Portals need newspapers to provide content, and the newspapers in turn need the portals to publicize their articles, attract readership, and pay the nominal subscription fees. Indeed, some portals have even been known to pass a juicy story onto newspaper reporters so that it can appear in print, and then giving them license to reprint it, right? So they come up with it, and then they sort of use the papers as a way to print it back because they're not allowed to do their own original reporting. Or as another reporter notes, China is a huge country, and the portals will always need local media partners to cover local stories. Okay, so now I'll hand it over to Maria. Yeah.
Guess I don't need this extra mic. So I'm going to go through very briefly the key points in which the internet helps investigative and critical journalism in China. So although, of course, it poses certain challenges that Jonathan just discussed, that although journalists seem to be quite optimistic about facing, it also presents an opportunity. It facilitates the conduct, publication, as well as the effectiveness of the more critical investigative reports. So I'll go through each one briefly with some examples. In terms of the conduct, journalists that we spoke to talk about getting their ideas from the internet, the story ideas. So there are several ways in which they get them. First of all, of course, they participate in the microblogging platforms and discussions, but also the list that the Central Publicity Department circulates about sensitive topics reaches the journalists, and although these topics are quite difficult to cover, they might be able to cover some facets of these topics. In addition, journalists share their ideas with one another. So this is so-called spillover technique, where journalists in one province or even a city might be restricted by local pressures, local authorities to cover this certain topic. He might share this information with journalists across the country, and someone might actually take interest to travel to that place and cover the story. This has happened a lot in the past and now has been quite restricted due to complaints from local officials. But nonetheless, based on quite recent interviews, journalists are still finding ways to circumvent this regulation and publish stories about other regions. In terms of publicizing the reports, of course, firstly, they can spread the existing reports to broader audiences, but more so, the internet can serve as a sort of backslide or a backdoor for publishing reports that have been banned in traditional media. So publishing this can be in two ways. For example, the first way is simply using a different name and publishing it in microblogs. This, again, is kind of facing some restrictions now because there are requirements to register with a real username. However, for now, the journalists seem to be avoiding this restriction as well. We'll see how that plays out in the future. The second thing is creating your own sort of news blog or some kind of a platform for discussing alternative perspectives on certain events. For example, one of our interviewees from Xinhua agency has spent many years in the agency, came back from overseas and set up his own blog where he actually hired some journalists to comment on news events in a different way, or they would travel and cover these events. So that's kind of an alternative perspective to news in the mainstream media. Third, in terms of effectiveness, there are two facets of effectiveness of critical reports that we found. The first facet is getting the official reaction. So of course, if there is more public discourse online, the public picks up the story, there is much more enthusiasm and more pressure on authorities to react. And we've seen that throughout our discussion in the past 2 days with authorities reacting quicker to events that are both sort of covered in the media as well as in the public debate online. If it's only in the media, it seems like it doesn't get that much attention. And secondly, it helps journalists to stay out of trouble. So journalists who have gotten in trouble with authorities can use online networks to help advocate each other's causes. This used to be much more difficult in the past, with official journalist associations not being that helpful, according to our interviews. So they tend to be quite limited, whereas now they can actually spread one another's causes and get help. For instance, one interviewer we spoke to a few years ago, his friend was reporting on Deng Yujiao case on corruption, and he was beaten quite severely. After sending a text message to a friend in Nanfang Week, this friend managed to spread the message all over microblogs as well as throughout, his community of journalist friends, and the beaten journalist has been released quite quickly after that. I don't know how common this happens, but it's still quite an important positive trend in terms of the effectiveness of long-term critical investigative reporting in China. So all of these suggestions, these kind of findings, they show that the relationship between new media and traditional reporting is quite complex and multifaceted in China. We see that it somewhat contradicts some theories that we see in the West about the negative relationship between these two types of media. And this, very quickly, in conclusion, I will talk about some implications of this relationship for Chinese media industry, media-state relations, and state-society relations. So in terms of the media industry, we expect the more professional, the most adaptive outlets to survive the competition in the long term. And perhaps the less adaptive ones are likely to lose out the game as they do in the West. The interviews we spoke to who were the most optimistic about their future were the ones who, as Jonathan talked about, spend time actually abroad, learning new skills. They embrace technology. They're quite enthusiastic about this transition to the digital world as opposed to resisting it and holding back. Of course, the official media that's still subsidized by the state might go through the competition without adapting as quickly. But I think in the long term, it will still face some similar pressures. In terms of state media relations, we're expecting them to be even more contentious and complex as a result of these developments. So on the one hand, the internet empowers journalists to bypass censorship, perhaps to publicize more stories. On the other hand, it also empowers the state to use more preemptive censorship and to circumvent these efforts. So in this case, it actually makes it more challenging for journalists to publish these stories. So it's a very kind of a circular movement which is likely to be even more tense in the future as more outlets move online. And finally, in terms of the state-society relations, again, on the one hand, these developments might lead to the society sort of empowerment of being able to pressure the state to be more accountable. On the other hand, this development also might lead to diminished capacity of other institutions or accountability mechanisms in China, such as the judiciary. So what we've seen a lot in recent years is that the judiciary might bend to pressures from the media combined with the public discourse online and changes decisions. And that could in times be positive, but at times it can also be quite a negative trend, because it sort of compromises the state's capacity to build a comprehensive accountability system in China with all different mechanisms working together and strengthening each one of them as opposed to just playing one against the other. So this is something to watch out for, and we're looking forward to doing more research on this and to hearing your comments. Thank you very much.